and it's acceptable to drink any time of the day.
There you go. Greetings, everyone that's just coming on. We're going to wait probably 2 more minutes, and then we will get started. Our events manager,
Kevin,
Sarah, are you still on? That's okay. I believe the rest, and this is the webinar format, I believe everyone is automatically muted except for the 3 panelists.
Feel free to type in any comments or questions into the chat box, and we'll address them as we can.
Those of you who are just logging onto the webinar, we'll get going here in just a second. Okay, let's go ahead and we're going to get started. My name is Kevin Carroll. I'm Executive Director of Tech San Diego. Thank you for joining us today. We know there's a lot of webinars, a lot of other things going on. The purpose of these is to get smaller groups together. These aren't necessarily canned presentations, so we're going to have a more intimate audience and panelists, so we can ask these questions through the chat. We could be very specific on things. A lot of the issues are coming up are regarding leasing and landlords and renting. We just, Tech San Diego had a joint CEO finance roundtable meeting this morning, and that was certainly a big topic of discussion. Regardless of whether your lease is up right now, there's impacts. Dennis, to give you an example of one of the questions that came up, someone had asked, well, if we're going to apply for the PPP and our landlord says we could defer our leasing payments for the next, the next 3 months, we could apply it to the next 2 years of our lease. Is that going to affect PPP? So questions like that. And so let's get right to it. I am going to turn it over to our presenters today. I'm not going to read their bios. They can introduce themselves if they like. Dennis Hearst and Bryan Bazzi from CBRE. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dennis and Bryan and let you guys go.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us. I'm Dennis Hearst, Senior Vice President at CBRE. I specialize exclusively in tenant representation, as does my partner, Bryan. And we wanted to talk about some of the major topics that are going around relative to coronavirus as it relates to real estate transactions, leases, and rental payments. So first, let's look at the agenda. Bryan's going to briefly address some current situation in the market. A lot of people are asking questions about our rental rates dropping and what's going on with vacancy, et cetera. I'm going to focus on some relevant lease clauses. There's a lot of confusion and clarity needed on understanding those lease clauses, the importance of notice dates, and I wanted to, even though I'm an exclusive tenant representative, I wanted to give some insight on the landlord's perspective, because this will lead us into the next section, our last section, which is the best way to craft effective solutions for the requirements of tenants in today's market. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bryan, to give us a brief update on what's going on in the market.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Hi, everyone. I'm Bryan Bazzi. I work with Dennis Hearst as a partner at CBRE in San Diego on the occupier team, also known as the tenant representation team. And what I'm going to be going over today is a lot of our clients are asking the question on what is happening in the market. Are things changing dramatically and quickly? And the answer is yes. Everything is changing. Things are very fluid right now. And I'm going to start with giving you a recap of what happened in Q1 2020. This recap does encompass the COVID-19 effects that started to take place in the later half of Q1 2020. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the asking rate in San Diego. For the 10th consecutive quarter, it actually increased overall for all class types in San Diego to $3.20 full service gross rentable square foot. This is actually the highest asking rate on record for San Diego. Vacancy rate rose 30 basis points to 10.7%. This was unchanged year over year, but actually the lowest in this cycle. 1.4 million square feet of projects are currently under construction in San Diego. This is the highest level of activity that we've seen since Q2 of 2008. Much of this construction is actually pre-leased. The unemployment rate, which was just released for February 2020, was 3.2%. And this is the lowest February rate that we've seen since 1990, and 110 basis points below the state and 60 basis points below the national averages. Though there's been a lot of changes that happened right at the start of Q2 2020, there are a lot of things that will be changing. And one of those is the unemployment rate. With the new strict stay-at-home orders, industries are really being negatively affected. And the US economy is headed into a recession. So things are rapidly changing. And in the short term, the unemployment rate is expected to rise. If San Diego does reflect the state and national unemployment claim data, we should expect the local unemployment rate to near or exceed 10% by the April report. So now going into San Diego, what's happening right now in the market? Asking rates in San Diego have not dropped at all and actually remain completely unchanged. Vacancy remains very stable as well. Construction projects are also moving forward in a slower fashion now, since the city is actually taking a little longer to issue permits and go through a lot of the more normal routines that they were going through, so which has caused some slowdown, but every project is still moving forward in that sense. Nationally, the economic view is extremely fluid and dynamic. We see information being released daily, and there are a lot of new updates that are happening. And in CBRE's latest economic forecast, we project a loss of 20% GDP in Q2 2020, but a strong recovery to start in Q3 2020. Overall, for 2021, we expect a GDP growth of 5%. Given the recent events related to COVID-19, we expect some dramatic workplace changes to take effect. And some of the trends that we expect to see when these stay-at-home orders are lifted, employees are asked to return back to their offices, are a reduction in the seating density at offices, which may mean schedules for when certain employees are allowed to be in the office versus be at home, rearranging office furniture, making the actual workplace feel comfortable for their employees when they do return, increased emphasis on health and wellness. Probably the number one thing that we're going to see is enhanced cleaning protocols for janitorial companies. Well, they'll be doing a more deep cleaning of the entire office, and employees may be asked to pitch in and clean workspaces before they leave. Along those lines of the health and wellness at the office is people may be asked to not shake hands initially when they're going back to the offices. Social distancing is also expected to take place even at the offices. What that means is no more packed conference rooms or people hanging out in tight quarters talking, they'll be discouraged from doing those. So we may actually still see virtual meetings being conducted while everyone is in the office online. The last thing is actually enhanced indoor air quality. What that really has to deal with is an increase for higher air quality and how much outside versus inside air is utilized by HVAC units and what types of filters are being used. One thing's for sure, that technology once again has proven that it's extremely stable, and even resistors that once, even like most recently, we had resistors that said they were not going to use these technologies. They're kind of are forced to use these now while they're at home. And security has become a major issue and a focus of many companies. So tightened security and technology is here to stay. One of the longer term trends that we will see is an increase of employees that are working remotely. So many companies are going to be deciding on, for the long term, what employees will actually be working from the office versus at home, or making some sort of transition or hybrid workplace for remote employees. And it's just, we are really expecting all these dramatic changes to take place, and every company will have their own view and changes, and it will be something to keep an eye out for. With that, I'm going to leave it to Dennis now to go over all the relevant lease clauses. Thank you.
All right, so there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of debate about clauses in the lease and how effective they are dealing with tenant issues during the crisis. So we're going to address these 5 most commonly discussed and often misunderstood elements of the lease. First is interruption of essential services. And basically, there's almost always a section in the lease that's titled services or something like that. And it requires that the landlord provide certain services to the building. And then it often provides a list of what those services are. Some of the issues that are coming up, access, if the building is denying access to the tenants, but that's often not listed as an essential service, so it may be an implied essential service. We don't have any anecdotal stories on that yet, or that's not been settled in law. Many leases do specifically list access, but what's happening is most landlords are making sure that they're not locking the tenants out of the building. They're not turning off the utilities. If it's a multi-tenant building, they're not shutting down the elevators. And if there's security for the building, maybe a security guard in the lobby or something like that, they're maintaining those essential services just so that tenants cannot, not just so, but largely so that tenants cannot claim an interruption of essential services and some kind of an abatement of rent. And first of all, I want to emphasize that I'm not giving legal advice. I'm talking about some practical, broker-oriented interpretation of the lease and how it's working in practicality. You certainly urge everybody on these issues to get the advice of expert counsel. I do strongly recommend that if you do seek counsel, that you look specifically to somebody who has extensive experience in lease transaction negotiation as an attorney. And if you don't have somebody that fits that bill, Bryan and I are happy to give you a few recommendations. But if access, for example, or we want to claim that the landlord isn't providing the 5-day-a-week janitorial, which they may not be because there's nobody in the building, do we want to claim that as an interruption of essential services? A couple things to watch here. First of all, if it's inside the landlord's control, leases typically have some kind of a cure period. And if it's outside the landlord's control, there may be a much longer cure period. So if it's in the landlord's control, it may call for rental abatement after 3 to 5 consecutive days, or maybe 10 or 12 days in a calendar year. And if it's outside the landlord's control, it may be a longer period of time, typically 30 days. But what's important is, if you are going to look at this clause for some kind of relief, it's important that you provide notice to the landlord that you're claiming an interruption of the services, and that would trigger the landlord having a cure period, and they're probably going to keep the buildings open and operating. The other clause we see is casualty and that usually has to do with if there's damage to the building, making the premises untenable or untenable or partially untenable. Whether this qualifies as damage is debatable. It may be that if there's let's say there was some kind of a massive infection in the building and the building was closed while they cleaned up such an infection, that might qualify under casualty, but typically that would be, that we're seeing that's being completed out in the market by these commercial mitigation companies, and they're doing it inside the normal cure period. So both of these clauses are not likely to provide much leverage or relief, but check with counsel. Condemnation, so that's an interesting one. So that may be a taking or partial taking by the government of the premises. And that may actually qualify here if there's been a stay-in-place order. However, most leases call for the tenant to turn to the condemning authority, the government, for relief or compensation. So I think that's going to be problematic and also not generally fruitful here. The other big one that's causes a lot of confusion, and the last topic in here is force majeure. And it's addresses where either party's obligations can either be delayed or excused because of circumstances outside of that party's control. Force majeure clauses typically list the items that are agreed to between the parties that would qualify. Sometimes government restrictions and regulations appear in those lists. And however, so it may qualify as force majeure. And if the tenant improvements were being built out and the lease was supposed to start on June 1 because the tenant improvements were expected to be completed by then, and because of COVID-19, construction has been delayed, that would probably trigger an automatic delay in the commencement of the lease. However, where TIs have already been completed and this premises has already been delivered and occupied, in most cases, force majeure does not relieve a tenant from paying rent. So that's not likely to be fruitful. So let's talk about what is fruitful. Access. First of all, find out if your tenant suite is available for use. If for some reason the landlord has the building locked out, that could be fruitful. But we're finding out that that's rarely the case. Government action. Has the tenant's decision not to occupy the space been caused by government action, curfew or shelter in place? And the tenant and landlord should consider that situation, even if it's outside the four corners of the lease, and talk about how to treat each other fairly because of that. And there should be a discussion about how long we think this is going to last and how much it's actually affecting the tenant's business. Essential services. Is the tenant providing the essential services, especially utilities and HVAC, cleaning and janitorial, and security services? We're finding out that the landlords are typically providing these, but there may be some instances where there's a claim. But in making a claim, you have to provide notice, and the landlord would have a right to cure it, and they probably would. And then damage. So physical damage probably isn't going to qualify for anything unless there's some kind of a specific infection or case in the building or outbreak in the building, in which case they're usually cleaning that up inside the cure period. Insurance. This is an interesting one. Most leases require that the tenants maintain certain insurance policies. Included in those insurance policies are business interruption insurance. Landlords often require that. There, I would check with your insurance broker to find out whether business interruption insurance, your inability to use your office space, would qualify for claim under the insurance. And often there's also rental abatement insurance, and that means if you're prevented from using the space, and in fact don't use your space, and you have to go out and lease substitute space, then your rental and your business insurance may provide coverage for that duplicate rent, but it doesn't usually provide coverage for the initial rent itself. So most companies have just adopted a work at home because that's in the spirit of shelter in place, and they're not out leasing substitute space, for example, if the building was damaged by earthquake or fire. So check with your insurance broker, but that's not necessarily going to provide constructive relief or leverage. So Bryan and I wanted to say that we're all operating in an environment unlike anyone we've ever seen before. But we want to encourage and facilitate productive dialogue. There's been some unproductive dialogue between occupiers, tenants, and the owners around relevant lease provisions, understanding each other's current circumstances, and then looking for the best potential business solutions. Working with that spirit, I think we can achieve, and Bryan and I are already achieving some really positive outcomes for our clients. Before we get into some examples of those solutions, I want to talk about notice dates. Most of you are dealing with this crisis, and a lot of times real estate is the last thing you want to focus on. And other than the issue of paying rent, a lot of leases are not being focused on. But I want to emphasize that many of the important clauses in leases have language in there that says very clearly the time is of the essence in the application of that clause. So pay attention to your lease expiration date, because that's not going to change. If you have a renewal option, especially if you have a renewal option that has some tenant favorable language or some elements of that you want to be able to implement, maybe you have the ability to renew for less than all of the space. And if you miss your option dates, the landlord might say you can only renew if you renew for all of the space. So especially if you have some favorable language in there that you would like to take advantage of, do not miss your renewal option deadlines. You may want to go to the landlord and say, hey, let's extend that for 30, 60, 90 days or something, but don't miss the deadlines. You may have, in the event that you might be looking for expansion space, and some of our clients actually are, their businesses has actually had a big boom here. Right of first offer, right of first refusal, right of first negotiation, and option to expand deadlines. Do not miss those. You may also have some contraction rights or an early termination right in the lease. And a lot of times they require timely notice, sometimes a payment of an early termination fee, et cetera. And because time is of the essence of almost all of these clauses, you want to make sure that you don't miss any deadlines. Another item that comes up as deadlines is a lot of times a landlord might send out an estoppel, and you have typically 10 business days to execute it and get it back, or you're in default of the lease. And if you're in default of the lease, it can erase your ability to do an operating expense audit, erase your ability to expand, erase your ability to exercise an option to renew, and a number of other rights under the lease are invalid during a period in which you're in default or breach. So don't miss a deadline to get an estoppel properly reviewed and edited and back to the landlord in a timely manner, or an SNDA, subordination non-disturbance agreement. Those typically also have pretty draconian deadlines. And then the other thing I just want to remind you on notices, if you're going to claim some type of a landlord default, either access to the building, interruption of essential services, or something else, most of those clauses require that you provide the landlord notice in advance of claiming a rent offset. And so make sure that you understand the notice provisions. Now I want to talk a little bit about understanding the landlord's perspective, and I think this will lead, and has for me and Bryan, led to some productive outcomes. First of all, the landlord, here's what we're typically seeing. Tenants are going to their landlords and saying, we want 90 days of free rent, April, May, June, and we want 90 days of half rent. That's a very, very typical ask. And a very typical response from the landlords, at least the first response is no. But what if no? But how about no? So here's a couple of the issues. First of all, if there's a mortgage on the building, any kind of a modification of the lease may require lender approval. So there's a risk that the lender may not approve it. And there's a risk that even if the lender does approve it or something like the request, it's going to take a long time. The landlord's ability to give all the tenants in the building 100% rent relief, even for a brief period of time, would affect their ability to make the mortgage payments. So maybe 60% of their cash flow or 50% of their net operating income goes to mortgage payments. They may be able to drop your rent in half much more easily than giving full rent relief. So we're seeing half rent for longer periods of time than shorter periods of time of no rent obligation at all. A lot of times the loan, and I use this, there's the golden rule. Everybody knows the golden rule, and that's he who has the gold gets to make the rules. And for about 20 years now in commercial real estate, the golden rule applies to the lenders. So landlords often to go out and get the best terms for their commercial loans, agree to certain loan covenants, which preclude them from making any modification to the lease or any modification to the lease without specific lender approval, or they can only make a modification to the lease if it doesn't go below collecting enough monthly rent to meet the debt service. So I think you just need to understand that. It's best to work out an agreement with the landlord that doesn't require lender approval and doesn't jeopardize their ability to make their mortgage payments. The next thing from the landlord perspective is very quickly, even before the CARES Act was enacted, a lot of landlords were being asked to forego rent. So they don't want to be the tenant's bank necessarily, and they don't want to be the first person to feel pain. So we're going to talk about some of the provisions of the CARES Act, and the landlords are going to want to see that the tenants have looked to the CARES Act and tried their best to get relief there before coming to the landlord, or at least in parallel with coming to the landlord. So under the CARES Act, we have three major programs. One's the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program. It's effective April 3rd, and small businesses, generally with 500 or fewer employees, can get up to 8 weeks of payroll plus 25% on top of that. And it's typically used for meeting payroll. Its interest rate is 0.5%. There's no fees, no collateral, no personal guarantees. A couple of points. We encourage everybody to apply as early as possible because there's a $349 billion cap, and there's a lot of people waiting in line for that money. And of course, there's discussions in Congress about adding another $250 billion into that. But the interest rate is somewhat unimportant because the loan is fully forgiven, becomes a grant if the employees are maintained, either keeping them on or quickly rehiring them and maintaining salary levels. But the other thing we want to point out is that these funds from the PPP can be used to pay rent, they can be used to pay utilities and certain other business expenses. The Economic Injury Disaster Loans, EIDLs, you can apply for an immediate $10,000 advance, which does not need to be repaid. It's a loan at 3.75% interest, and it's for paid sick leave for employees, maintaining payroll, paying utilities, paying rent, and so the landlords are going to want to see that you've applied for both of these. And then there's enhanced debt relief. So, and this is basically for SBA loans. So for anybody that has an existing SBA loan, excuse me, contact your lender directly with questions. But there will be programs for relief. And if you want to apply for a new 7A SBA loan, you can, there would be an abatement of principal and interest on new loans. And if you'd like some help setting up a new 7A SBA loan, CBRE has a complete division that does business lending representation, and they'd be happy to put you in touch with them and have you help. So the landlords are going to want to see that you looked at those resources before coming to them or in parallel with coming to them. And here's what we're seeing. The first topic we want to talk about is, Bryan, you can do the next slide, is communication. I'm a strong believer that there's a right and a wrong way to do that. Typically what happens is the tenant reaches out to their main point of contact with the landlord. That's often the property manager. And property managers are almost by definition conditioned to say no, and they'll say no 2 or 3 times. And sometimes it's just like, we don't want to pay rent, or we're not going to pay rent for April, May, June. We don't think that's the right way to do communications. I think it needs to be the property manager can certainly be copied, but I think there needs to be some direct communication to the asset manager or the actual owner of the building. And if there's a relationship between the tenant and the actual building owner or asset manager, that may be a productive channel of communication, but it should be approached sort of politely and productively. But more often than not, you're better off to contact your broker and have your broker contact the landlord's broker. That way they can talk about things and not upset each other or unduly concern each other, and let the brokers play a broker function. That's been very effective. The next item we would say is be clear about your ask. A lot of times they just say, we want rent relief, or we want rent relief for 90 days, but they don't talk about what happens after 90 days. And that ask should probably be in writing in some kind of an email. And then here's the main thing we wanted to talk about, and that is crafting a mutually acceptable solution. What landlords are often saying, if they don't say no, they're saying, we want some financial disclosure. We want to see your financial statements, your balance sheet, and your P&L. We want to see if it's maybe a law firm or an accounting firm or whatever, and there's partners, we want to see tax returns for 2 years. They don't want to see that there was a massive profit distribution in January, February to the partners, and now they're asking the landlord for rent starting in April, rent relief starting in April. They often want to see a business plan that shows what your projections are for business drop-off, what your projections are for business recovery. And these are all reasonable requests, but they're pretty extensive and frankly, kind of a pain. But we've also seen when attention is paid to something that works pretty well for the landlord, we've actually seen them drop those requests and just roll up our sleeves on a productive solution. One of those obviously is understanding what's important to the landlord. So the landlord's really important to the landlord is increasing net operating income. Let's see if I can give a quick example. If they want to either sell the building or put a loan on the building, or if it's in an institutional portfolio, they do an annual appraisal of the building and look at how the value of the portfolio is being affected. That's often how they get compensated. They want to increase net operating income. So if a really nice office building would sell at a 6 cap rate, it's basically selling at 16 and a half times the annual net operating income. And some of the rent is going to go out for taxes and insurance and property maintenance stuff. So any increase in NOI, because those other costs are relatively fixed, any increase in net operating income can greatly enhance the value of the building to the landlord. So what we're seeing is the landlord will say, yeah, I'll give you 3 months of free rent and 3 months of half rent, or maybe I'll give you 8 or 9 months of half rent. And then you'll pay it back over the term of your lease without interest. But what we want to do is not count it as a rent forgiveness repayment like a loan and amortized payments of loan, even if it's amortized without interest. We then want to calculate what that monthly without interest payment would be over the balance of the term of your lease and put it in an amendment. And let's say your rent is $2.50, and now it's going to be increased to $2.62. They'll give you the rent relief, and they want to do an amendment of the lease, raising the rent to $2.62. And that is a way for the landlord to see a benefit, maybe even show a benefit to his lender and to his clients. And they really like that solution. So we've also had some tenants come back and say, well, we're willing to pay it back over a faster period of time. We'll pay it back over 1 or 2 years. The landlords actually don't prefer that, we're finding. They want it added in straight line over the balance of the term. Maybe it goes into the base rent and it goes up with a 3% a year annual escalation. It's pretty minor interest on a loan, but they want to show it as if it's a higher base rental schedule. So that's a very productive. The other thing landlords want is they want a longer term on the lease. And so maybe you have just 1 or 2 years left on the lease. A landlord might say, well, I'll give you 1 month free for every year that you add on to the term. So I won't even make you pay back 2 of the 3 months of free rent if you'll add 2 years onto your term. You want to make sure that if you're paying a market or above market rent, that might not be a prudent decision to make. If you're paying a below market rent, that might be okay. And just think about your flexibility. And if you have an option to renew that's coming up in the next year and you're not planning on relocating out of the building, you may want to just early negotiate your option to renew. So Bryan and I are working on a deal right now where the 5-year option to renew fair market rental rate is going to be determined. And then we're going to give the tenant 3 months of free rent and 3 months of half rent. And then that's going to be added in on top of the 5-year option to renew fair market rental rate and without interest. And that is also, the tenant's going to get a tenant improvement allowance as part of their refurbishment or the renewal. They don't need all of the allowance that they're going to get based on fair market comps. And so there's an application, that's their choice, is to apply that. Although I think the landlord would prefer that they convert that into free rent and still do a slight increase in the rental rate. We already have some letters of intent out for execution between tenants and landlords actually implementing these decisions. We expect to have a couple of them done in the next 2 or 3 business days with amendments to follow. And I think if people go to the landlord courteously, politely, show them that the landlord is not the first person to feel pain, but they can also demonstrate that when they come out of this, that they will have a viable enterprise. That's what the landlord wants, and maybe be willing to pay it back in the form of higher rent and or longer term. I think there could be a high success rate between tenants and landlords at this tough time. Bryan, put up the next slide and we'll talk about some resources. So here's a list of resources. I think they're all very helpful. In addition, Bryan and I are happy to review any of your leases. And maybe my picture just went away, Sarah. Bryan and I will be happy to review your leases for you, gratis. And if you don't have expert real estate leasing counsel and you want some advice on, we'll give you 1 or 2 or 3 names of people that are really good at that. And then if you want to pursue a new SBA 7A loan, we can put you in touch with some people that specialize in guiding clients through that process. There's one other item that I wanted to mention real quickly, and that is, I think many of you know that the city of San Diego enacted an eviction moratorium ordinance, and that was effective on March 25. And basically what it says is that there's no evictions for non-payment of rent, but the conditions are you have to go to the landlord and tell them that you have an inability to pay the rent before the rent is due. And this applies to residential tenants as well as commercial tenants. Within 1 week of providing that notice, you have to give reasonable documentation or objectively verifiable information to support your position that you're unable to make the rent payment and that it's due to COVID-19. And then this lasts for 6 months, either from March 25 or when Governor Newsom lifts the stay in place executive order, whichever occurs sooner. So that's just one other recourse if somebody's really strapped and can't get any immediate relief there. So we have about 20 minutes. Sarah, I don't know if we've explained to people how to put a question into the chat, but maybe you, if there are any questions, maybe you field the question and take yourself off mute, field the question, pass it on to me, and Bryan or I will be happy to answer.
Dennis, there is one question that was asked, a few questions, and one of them is, what if your landlord closes the office building and you are an essential business and are unable to access?
So if you are denied access to the building, the first thing I would do is look at the services section of the lease, and that's where it typically says that the landlord needs to provide the following in order to be in compliance with the lease. And if one of them is specifically listed as access, or if the landlord in the process of shutting down the building has also stopped operating the elevators or turned off the utilities to the building, then I would look at either utilities, access, or elevators, and I would check with counsel. But that's the rare instance where you probably have the ability to abate rent if the condition lasted. And if it's within the landlord's control, I think it's typically 5 days. If it's outside their control, it may be 30 days. This would be inside their control because the state and San Diego mandates do not say that you have to refuse access to buildings. But then you would need to provide notice to the landlord that you're claiming an interruption of essential services and intend to withhold rent, and then they would have a right to cure, and they would probably reallow access. Interestingly, this is often coming up, much more common coming up in multi-tenant office buildings. Anecdotally, our industrial brokers at CBRE have been asked to go out and drive through industrial parks to determine in real life what's happening in industrial parks. And they're typically single-tenant industrial buildings and maybe even multi-tenant industrial buildings. And we're finding out that 70 to 80% of the buildings or premises are actually being operated from during this time. There may be a slow operation, maybe a skeleton crew in there. Some of them are actually being quite active. So it's applying a lot less to industrial buildings where the landlord almost doesn't manage the building on a day-to-day basis. That if it's a single-tenant building, the tenant is really in control of that. But we are seeing it for multi-tenant office buildings. If the landlord has denied access and or turned off the elevators or utilities, I'd check with my counsel. I'd make a claim for rental abatement. You've got to provide notice, and the landlord will probably unlock the building before the deadline.
Dennis, this is Kevin Carroll. So one of the surprising aspects, and I think that Bryan alluded to this earlier, is that, we saw these early stories. For instance, a Cheesecake Factory isn't going to negotiate. They're just not going to pay rent for 3 months. And while I think that may be fine if you're in a mall and there's no other tenants possible, people are under the illusion that they're going to get, if they're renegotiating a lease now, that those drops are going to be fairly dramatic. And I guess what I'm hearing from both you and Bryan is that's not the case. Can you confirm that?
Okay, so for today's presentation, giving our audience being presumed tech oriented, I didn't address retail. In retail, it's a crisis. It's a huge mess. And most of those operations are unable to operate at all, and they're going to need relief either from the government. A lot of the shopping malls are closed. A lot of retail centers are actually closed. And so I didn't address what's going on.
No, I'm just trying to draw a distinction between retail and, our audience, which is tech. And I think some tech folks believed that there would be some dramatic changes in costs, especially if they're renegotiating at the present time. They're thinking, geez, great, this is a great time to renew my lease. I was paying $250 a square foot. I bet you I'm going to get 70 or 80 cents. And what I'm hearing from Bryan and you is that's not the case.
It's not. And just like in 2008, 2009, rents ultimately went down. In some cases, I would say 10 to 30%. We might see that happening depending on how long this lasts and the shape of the recovery. But we're not seeing any deals being closed, any new transactions being closed. We are seeing some people that are entering into early lease extension or lease renewal negotiations, but we're not seeing any new leases. And because the leases can't be terminated, the landlords are not going to feel the vacancy or the reduction in rent, other than what we're talking about here, until those leases expire. So one of the buildings we've been talking to is Hazard Center in Mission Valley. It's a 15-story granite building at Friars and 163. That building is 99% leased. There's only 1% of the building is vacant. There are no leases expiring in the next 12 to 15 months. And that landlord isn't about to just drop the rent today. They may want to wait and see what kind of a recovery before they sort of just determine what kind of rent reduction they might need to make in order to keep their building fully occupied and keep people renewing. So they'll work now on crafting some really attractive terms for a renewal, but generally in the form of some tenant improvements and free rent, but probably not in the way of any kind of a dramatic reduction in rent. I think if we're going to see that, it's because we go into Q3 and Q4 without a robust recovery, and the landlords are viewing this as kind of a long-term recovery like from the Great Recession. Again, retail is different. So many of those tenants have no ability to pay the rent at all, or if they pay the rent, they'll go bankrupt, or they can't keep their employees. And so in retail, it's a very, very different picture.
So Dennis, if you're up on let's say you're up on May and June, is it reasonable to ask your landlord, let's just stay in place, or how should those conversations go? I mean, it's if you're signing a 3 to a 5 year lease and you're up in June, what do companies need to start thinking about?
Okay, so if your lease is expiring in June, probably in June of 19, between June and September of 2019, would have been the notice dates for you to exercise an option to renew. And if your lease is up in June and you haven't made your plans of either you're going to stay and under what terms, or where you're going to move and how you're going to get there, you're so far. I don't think any of the tenants out there today are that far behind the curve. So typically, anybody whose lease is coming up that's of immediate concern is probably at least 9 to 12 months out. And if they are in that 9 to 12 month window, they need to make sure they don't miss any important notice dates. So if they want to preserve any option to renew language. And yeah, now would be a good time to roll up the sleeves of the landlord and say, we could move. We have 9 months, 12 months to move. We could move, but let's focus on our business. Let's not focus on the CapEx of a relocation. Let's roll up our sleeves and see if you can give me some really good short-term relief. Maybe we enter into the option to renew language today. Bryan and I are working on this, and the free rent and extra TIs that are convertible to free rent as part of that option to renew language are going to be applied during the last 12 months of the current term, as opposed to applied in the first year of the renewal term.
All right, we do have another question. So what happens to my personal effects at the office if my employer stops paying rent? And the same question, if you are separated employee.
Okay, so if you're saying if the landlord stops paying rent, I'm sorry, Bryan.
No, it's if the employer stops paying rent. So what happens to an employee's personal effects in that case?
I see. Well, that in an eviction, the landlord usually reserves certain rights to claim FF&E, and the tenant can't remove those things, and the landlord holds on to all that stuff. But there's a moratorium, and there's a moratorium on evictions. So there won't be any eviction action by the landlords probably for at least 6 months. And it'd be probably against your company's rules to go into that space and pick up your family pictures, your whatever you have in your locker at work or in your drawers, and the tchotchke off your credenza. You probably can't go in there and get that, but the landlord's not going to touch that stuff because there's an eviction moratorium.
So what if you apply for the PPP and the rent goes into the consideration of that, and yet you're also negotiating with your landlord to extend your lease? You're looking at cash flow issues, Dennis, and so can you do both at the same time? Because I think if you apply for the PPP, there's an assumption that you're going to use some of that to pay, lease, and your leasing monies is included in that. Technically, I guess you're paying it if you wrap it into the rest of your leasing agreement. But I wonder how the government's going to look at that if you get the personal payroll guarantee loan and you're looking for relief from your landlord as well.
Okay, so that's a good question. I would encourage people to do both. Apply for PPP and apply right away. Why wouldn't you? If you qualify, I'd apply right away. And it's 8 weeks of salaries plus 25%. I'd go to the landlord and say, I need that extra 25% on top of the 8 weeks of salary to keep my people employed for 90 days. And I can keep them employed for 120 days if you give me rent relief. So let that PPP money go where it's primarily intended, and that is to either keep from laying people off or to promptly reemploy staff. And on top of that, look to the landlord and say, we have an even greater chance of success of being able to make it to a recovery if you'll also give us some rent relief. But and we're finding that many of the landlords are happy to give the rent relief, maybe more like half rent than complete rent abatement, if they can use it to their advantage by restructuring a slightly higher rental rate or a longer term. And I don't think they're going to say, well, you tell us, you come to us when you've run out of PPP money, and then we'll talk to you. I think they want to see that you're doing both.
And Dennis, I like your advice about going through your broker. For many, senior executives, it's very emotional, right? They're facing a lot of issues right now. And so having that discussion with the landlord seems to be personal sometimes, and it shouldn't be. And so I think going through your broker to have those conversations would certainly be a better way to go rather than maybe even having them yourself.
Yes, it is an emotional issue. And I generally recommend having the brokers get involved. The brokers, don't get emotional with each other because it's not their issue, it's their client's issue. If they do get emotional with each other, as we brokers sometimes do, we have thick skins, it's our business, and it bounces off. The last thing you want to do is unless there's a really, really strong, warm relationship between the actual decision maker on the landlord part and the decision maker on the tenant part, you don't want to put those two parties together because maybe the ask was intended to be sincere, but it wasn't taken properly, or it wasn't made properly and somebody took umbrage with it, or somebody made a comment, somebody makes an emotional reaction back, and things can go downhill very quickly. The brokers can arm wrestle and forgive each other and arm wrestle again and then report back to the clients. It's a much, much better way to do it. It's why almost all negotiations, even renewal negotiations, are handled through brokers. And most brokers are not going to get paid for some kind of a rent relief structure, but they'll do it as a service. If there's a lease extension involved, there might be a small commission for adding a year onto the term. But most brokers are happy to do it for their clients, and they should be doing it. But again, the client has to set the right tone, and don't send the broker in there to pound his fist or demand a pound of flesh. You want to go in, not so much hat in hand, but you want to have your broker go in and make a reasonable request and be prepared to back it up with either financial information or, and all three transactions that Bryan and I are getting ready to close here, the landlords actually backed off on all of the requests for the detailed financial information. They accepted what was going on in the market. And because we've structured it in a way that actually works well for the landlord, they've been happy to do it without the onerous of financial information disclosures.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is to find a win-win. Before we close, Dennis, I know both you and Bryan are very, very busy right now, so I want to very much appreciate that you're spending your time helping the tech ecosystem get through this. We're all going to get through this together. I know you don't make these pitches, but I will make it for you. You can see right there where it says thank you. You can see how to get a hold of Dennis and how to get a hold of Bryan. I know both of them. They're both extraordinary in my book. I've worked with them for a number of years, so certainly if you need those services, give them a look. Tech San Diego has very few service provider members. We hand-pick them and hand-select them, and Dennis and CBRE is right at the top of our list. So again, I want to thank you guys. Dennis, I want you to make a commitment coming back on. When we get on the other side of this, I think companies are going to need to know how to put clauses in their leases that address the new conditions, whether that's janitorial or a room or whatever. We're going to need you to come back and talk to us about that. So if you can make that commitment to come back and talk to us in a while, we will gladly have you back on.
It'd be my pleasure. And there definitely will be a whole list of new things for tenants to focus on than we've focused on in the past. But when Towering Inferno, the big high-rise building in Los Angeles, went up in flames in what was the mid 1980s, it changed how lease documents were crafted. This one's going to have an even greater effect.
All right, remember, you could always go to techsd.org to find out more webinars and what's going on. We have one coming up in a couple of weeks with our friends from Moss Adams on the CARE Act, so we look forward to seeing you those. These are going to be short, they're going to be intimate, and hopefully they're going to be able to relay a lot of information very quickly. So again, thank you, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Bryan.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone. Let us know if you have any questions at all.